A couple of years ago, I attended with my son a homeschool excursion which was organised at Sydney University. The presentation was to do with DNA and other scientific complications, and it was presented by a group of young university students. However, the children who attended were aged between about 8 and 15 or 16. Most of them were about 10 to 12. And unfortunately, the university students used plenty of jargon and pitched the whole presentation, interesting as it was, to people in their own peer group. They didn't really know their audience. They didn't appreciate that the people who they were presenting their knowledge to were not like themselves, but they were different. They were children. They didn't understand the same words, the same language, and they weren't able to really grasp the message of the wonderful content that they were giving to these kids. Now, I ask myself, what would a group of postgraduate students like yourselves want to know about public speaking or oral communications, which is what this course is about? And I think, well, I imagine that most of this audience would like to know, most of all, how to get over nervousness or how to use nervousness well. And what to do with their hands and their body when they're giving an oral communication presentation. I imagine you'd want to know how to give a good seminar to fellow students or to any kind of audience, and how to organise your research data or your written material in a way that is palatable and easy to communicate. I imagine that you'd want to know how you might use different visual aids and use them in a helpful way to make your presentation more dynamic, easier for your audience to understand, and certainly not in a way that befuddles your audience. I imagine you might like to know how to summarise your material so that you can ask good questions and summarise the material of other presenters so that you can ask good questions and then be able to answer questions yourselves off the cuff at the end of any of your presentations. And I imagine that you would also like to know how to handle difficult questions, and how to handle difficult questioners. I suppose you'd like to know how to keep an audience interested and how to handle a difficult audience. Am I right? Are these the sort of things you'd like to know? Later on, we will be learning how to manage your speeches and put them into a concise, well-structured presentation. Later, we'll also be learning how to use our hands, our bodies effectively, and we'll have a workshop on speech construction. Already, you have had a presentation on how to be an effective listener and how to give good, helpful evaluations of your peers' presentations. And there's also already been a session about impromptu speaking, speaking off the cuff. In this presentation, we're going to speak about the audience, how to prepare and how to know your audience so that you can make a presentation that suits this particular audience. Ask yourself these questions. Why are you presenting this talk to this audience at this particular time? It is essential that you ask this question before you even begin to prepare your talk. Unless you know who your audience is and what they want from you and how you will best be able to deliver your message to them, you will have no guidelines upon which to prepare your speech. Who then is your target audience? Why do we need to know this? We need to establish the speaker-audience partnership so that your message will be heard and remembered. Knowing a little bit about your audience will help you to speak their language, and it helps them then to listen actively. Remember what we learnt in the active listening and evaluation session. So how then do we find out this information about the audience? Well, the most obvious thing would be to ask the person or the people who invited you to come and present in whatever the situation is. Another obvious way is email messages. If you have the opportunity, as I would have with you, I could email you or find out more about you on the discussion board. So if it is possible to communicate with your audience beforehand, you could do that. I was once giving a speech about education funding. I think I've mentioned it before. And I was very interested to know where my audience stood on the topic before I came to give the speech or before I even started to write. What can I do to find out? Well, I was able to be in touch with the audience, and so I went on to SurveyMonkey, which is available to anybody, and I presented a 10-question survey, which is free, so that I could find out from the audience where they stood on the topic. Then I was able to prepare a much more suitable presentation that was tailor-made for these particular people. And the other advantage was I already knew some of the questions that they might ask me at the end. You can go to public opinion sites. www.gallup.com will give you Australian survey results if you want to know more about what the community generally out there believes about your particular topic. Or you might prepare something similar to what I've done for you and have a before questionnaire to find out what people think about your particular topic, as I've done for you to find out what you believe about oral communications. In your case, I also have your speaker's CV and I have your peer introductions, so I already know a little bit about you, and that will help. Let's talk a little bit about different aspects of the audience background. This summary can be found in Module 4 under Know Your Audience. What will suit a general postgraduate audience? What sort of jargon might I be able to use? Or perhaps they're totally non-experts and I can use no jargon at all. You need to find out the answers to the following basic questions. First of all, what is the age range of your audience? Because you might speak differently to, for example, retirees than you would speak to school students. Aristotle found these things, and these things are still relevant. Young people generally are pleasure-loving. They are optimistic, impulsive, they are trusting and idealistic, and they are easy to persuade. Whereas older people are more set in their ways. They tend to be sceptical and even cynical. They are more concerned with maintaining the comfort they have. Aristotle found that people who are in the prime of their life have more of a balance between the other two, the young and the older. They are confident yet cautious, and they tend to judge with facts in a moderate way. Now, this was true for the people in Aristotle's time, and it's no different today. We ask ourselves about the gender of the audience. Why is this important? Well, in our presentation, we just need to be careful of stereotypes. For example, I might talk about the ability for women to multitask, but the men in the audience might not appreciate that, so perhaps I'll refrain, unless I know that my particular audience has no problem with me discussing these sorts of things. The cultural background of your audience is another thing worth finding out. I was once at a place where somebody gave a presentation that I had to evaluate. This lady, who was herself of ethnic origin, and I won't say what, but she made this broad sweeping statement, and she said, all white people can avoid suffering. Now, this was a core part of her presentation, and the aim of her presentation was meant to be to inspire her audience. And she stands there, she was a non-white lady, and says to her audience, all white people can avoid suffering. And what this lady didn't realise, but what I found out afterwards, after my evaluation, in which I said that this was something she should be cautious about because it might just offend some of the people in the audience. After I delivered that evaluation, a couple of visitors that day came to me and thanked me for saying that. These two ladies who thanked me were people who had survived Auschwitz. They were concentration camp survivors. And for them to have somebody get up and say, all white people can avoid suffering, was very hurtful. Not only that, but of course they were unable to listen any further once they heard that. You see how important it is to know the cultural background of your audience and not to make any sweeping statements, particularly if you might not know that much about your audience. Now, we also need to know a little bit about our audience's education. That could be helpful. How much do they already know? I was once asked to give a series of technical presentations explaining a software package. And I had to take in laptops, 10 laptops, and have 10 people sitting at laptops. And this was not a mouth-on, but a hands-on session. I had a video session up on the wall with my projector, and I demonstrated, and the people had to use their computers and the mouse to work out how to use this software. The interesting thing was that some of my audiences had people like you and me who are reasonably efficient and happy to use computers. There were some people in the group who could have written the program for themselves. But there were also some elderly people for whom the idea of a mouse was simply a squeaky little animal with a tail. And I actually had to hold their hands on the mouse and to help them and guide them to click on the various things because they couldn't hold it still long enough to do so. It was very important for me to understand the variety of people in that audience, and the only way I could know was to ask the question at the beginning before I began presenting, or certainly before I expected the hands-on component of the course to begin. The level of education of your audience will affect your approach, your wording, and the focus of your entire presentation. The more educated people tend to have a more extensive general knowledge. They tend to be more curious, and they tend to be more open to new ideas. They're open-minded. They're aware of alternative viewpoints to their own. Beware of this. You need to be well prepared. Generally, there are three types of audiences. There's the general audience, the audience who has no background whatsoever about your topic. I remember one of my past students, a wonderful Polish young gentleman called Przemek. Przemek studied pure maths, and he had an audience of people who had not studied pure maths. In fact, the audience in this student group was quite diverse. There were people from the School of the Environment, there was an astrophysicist, and there was Przemek. Przemek got up and gave his presentation with a lot of detailed PowerPoint and spoke about his topic in his own language, which none of us understood. When it came to the question time of his presentation, nobody put up their hands. There was no question, because none of us had understood any of what Przemek gave enough to be able to ask any question except, could you tell us that again? So the students together with me recommended to Przemek that he do that presentation again the following week. But this time we said, Przemek, can you somehow use language that we all understand? Can you use perhaps a metaphor of something that everybody knows about? Well, the following week, dear Shemek came back and he gave that same presentation, this time using language of cooking. He had colourful slides with photographs of meals and food, and the rest of us sat there with "ah" on our faces. Yes, if you are giving a presentation to a general audience who knows nothing about your topic, use language that everybody understands. The second type of audience is what we might call a common audience. People who have an interest in your topic, but no expertise. When I gave my speech about education funding, I knew my audience would have an interest in it. But I also knew that most of them really had no expertise. They didn't know all the facts and all the figures. They didn't know the difference between state funding in Australia and federal funding in Australia for private and Catholic schools. And this was what I wanted to explain to them. And so I had to allow for the fact that there were some things they didn't know, even though they had a general interest. The third type of audience is what you might call a specialist audience. These are the people who also are experts on the speaker's topic. These are academics. These are your peers. So yes, then you can be free to use your jargon. Another thing you need to know about the audience is what their attitudes and their beliefs are. This is very important for you if you want to communicate the message of your research topic to people who help form public decisions. Think about their social and their financial concerns. For example, the concerns of young families would be quite different to the concerns of retirees. Think of additional factors like perhaps their political attitudes or their occupation. Adjust your vocabulary to suit this. What is known already by them and what their interests are will determine the kinds of language that you use. Even their religious persuasion is important if you are going to be respectful in the way that you give your delivery. And of course, if you want your audience to be respectful to you, you do need to show respect for them. Otherwise, they're going to shut off. Even their audience's leisure, their social activities, their hobbies and their interests will affect the way that you can speak to them. Let's now talk about attitudes and beliefs. Attitudes are feelings. So my attitude to something is how I feel about it. Whereas beliefs are what we think we know. My belief is what I think I know about something. Our values are how we think we should behave given our attitudes and our beliefs. So my values is how I think I should behave given how I feel about something and what I think I know about it. For example, are people for or against capital punishment? If I feel that it's bad to murder and I know that killing is wrong, then I can't have a value of being for capital punishment. I must be against capital punishment. Sometimes you might have a negative audience. When this happens, what you need to do is establish an identity with the audience. Find out something that you have in common with them. You need to avoid emotional appeals because that will only make them sceptical and suspicious about what you're going to say. Limit then, if you think you might have a negative audience, limit what you think you would be able to, or what you hope you would be able to accomplish. Articulate it and simplify the message. Acknowledge the disagreement. Yes. When I got up to give that speech about education funding, I had that survey information and I knew there were some aspects where the audience, or some of the people in the audience, would disagree with me. And so I acknowledged that what I was going to say and what they believed might be different. And then I could work with that and explain my point of view. The same thing happened when I was once asked to give a presentation about Gregorian chant, and I knew that there would be some people in the audience who disagreed with the idea of using Gregorian chant in church. And I acknowledged this. I began each presentation with a sort of a Gregorian chant apologetics, if you like, and then we could move on together. Another thing I'd like to talk about now is the audience's expectations. This is also important to know. How long does this audience expect you to speak? And you better keep to time. Is your part the main attraction, or are you just a little bit of a whole? Perhaps you're an after-dinner speaker. Then you have to realise that there's going to be a lot of other stuff going on. There might be people giving out food or taking away plates, and you have to be able to work with that. Know how large your audience is going to be, because the kind of presentation you give and the kind of infrastructure you will need might have to be adjusted, whether the audience is a little one or a huge one in a big auditorium. Why does this group meet? Find out a little bit more about that. What common interests bring this particular group together? Is it a beach culture? Or are they business people? Or perhaps it's a group of sport people and they have that sport in common. The audience expects to be informed, or the audience expects to be entertained, or persuaded or inspired. Do you know? Find out what the audience expects of you and tailor your presentation to meet those expectations. Is the audience there because they chose to be, or were they forced to attend? You better find out that. And what are their responsibilities? Will they be making the decisions based on your presentation, or do they need to convince others to make those decisions? Will they want to ask questions of you at the end? If so, you will need to allow time for that as part of your presentation. Another thing you need to find out about is the venue itself and the resources contained therein. Practical considerations. Where are you speaking? Whenever I am asked to give a presentation, I make a point of, if I don't already know the venue, going there the week before or a few days before, so I can have a bit of a look around and ask around, find out where things are. If I need a microphone or if I don't. If I need a lectern or don't. What are the limitations of the room? I've given presentations where there were two great pillars in the middle of the room, and I had to make sure that none of my audience were going to be sitting on the other side of the pillar where they couldn't see me. How large will the room be where you're in? Are you going to use all of it? Or perhaps you'll gather your audience to the front so that you can better connect with them. Will the audience be in rows of chairs, or will they be at tables? Or maybe they'll even be standing up. You need to know about all of this. I once gave a presentation, in fact a whole series of presentations, in a science lab with lots of white noise. I had to make sure that either I could let my voice be louder, or we could switch off the white noise, or gather the people in the audience closer to me when I was speaking to them. All this reminds me of a speech I once attended given by Bryce Courtenay, the famous Australian author who died not very long ago. Bryce is a dynamic speaker. He likes to move around a lot when he gives his presentations, and he tells lots of stories. Of course, he's an author. He spoke about himself and his own family, and at one point he even threw himself on the floor as part of his presentation. But Bryce was very uncomfortable in this particular instance, because the stage that he was given upon which to stand had a huge, immovable lectern. It was big. There was no space for Bryce to stand in front of the lectern. He had no notes. He spoke not off the cuff, but he knew his presentation quite well. He'd probably given that speech many, many times before. Bryce didn't need or want a lectern. And the effect was, because he moves around such a lot as part of his speech, that he had to stand on this side of the lectern and then run around and stand on that side of the lectern. And I found, as a member of the audience, this was very off-putting, to have somebody run around from side to side like this. Now, I don't know what Bryce could have done, but I think if he'd known the kind of stage he was going to operate on in advance, he might have asked either if that huge lectern could be removed or pushed to one side, or indeed if he could have had the whole room changed around and stood somewhere else. Or maybe the tables and chairs could have come back a little and he could have stood down on the floor because the stage wasn't very high. Will you be on the stage or on a podium? Ladies, think about that. If you're up on a high stage and you have gents sitting right at the front, think about how short your hemline could be. Will you have a lectern? Will you need a lectern? If you have notes, yes, you'll need one. If you're not operating with notes at all and it's all in here, please get rid of the lectern. It would only make a barrier between you and your audience. Will you have a microphone? What kind of microphone if you do? Is it going to be one of those fabulous radio microphones that will allow you to move around as much as you like? Or is your microphone going to be one you hold in your hand, which means you only have one hand free to make any gestures? And you don't want to be switching hands all the time in that case, because that can also be quite off-putting to an audience. Or perhaps your microphone is actually going to be one that is just stuck to the lectern, and you're going to have to stay right there. You cannot move away to this side or that, because then the audience will no longer hear you. And if your microphone's one of those horrible pesky things that's too low or too high, who's going to fix it for you? Who's going to make sure that it's in the right position? Do you have to do this yourself, or will the MC prepare it? I'd be asking the MC for help there. Some years ago, the students who presented when I was working at Macquarie University were standing in this very limited area where the lectern was stationary and the microphone was stationary. And the lectern was also very high. I remember there was a very short lady who could hardly be seen at all. You could just see her head above the lectern. And that's not very helpful. And at the same presentation, some of the students chose to give PowerPoints. Now, those who were able to remove themselves from the lectern and stand right out in the middle ended up standing in the field of projection for the PowerPoint. And they were blinded, they looked uncomfortable, and they also spoilt what the audience could see of the presentation. These are all things to know about in advance. You don't want to have to be worrying about them once you start your speech. Speaking of all these sorts of things, what sort of visual aid infrastructure is available? What have you got? A screen or a blank wall? Or nothing? Do you perhaps need to turn the seating arrangements around, as I once had to do in one of my Toastmasters clubs, where there were curtains all on the one side and a stage down the end, and the club was used to always facing that way, looking at the stage. But I had a PowerPoint presentation, and at that point, my club didn't yet have a screen. And so when I arrived, I asked the MC if we could please, for this night, turn the whole room around to face the other side where there was a blank wall, because I wanted to be able to project on there. It took advanced planning on my part. I had to think ahead, know the venue, and then do something about it to make it suit the presentation that I was going to give. Sometimes I don't trust the visual aid material at a venue, and I always, if I'm projecting something, like to bring my own data projector along, at least as a backup, to make sure that if the data projector at the venue has a problem, I won't have a problem. Another thing to consider is the occasion of your speech. Is it a formal occasion, a solemn occasion, or is it a casual occasion? And why is this important? you need to consider what kind of attire, what kind of dress will be appropriate for you to wear. And you do want to look professional. Just as for a job interview, think of the rule of thumb to dress up just a little bit better than what you expect most of the audience would be wearing, because you are the star. As we've said before, think about if there's a meal, and if there is a meal involved, are you speaking before, which would be better, or are you speaking after the meal when everybody's energy is going out of their brain into their digestion process? These are important things to know. Are there other speakers apart from you? And if so, what is the order of speakers? Are you first or last or somewhere in the middle? Are you a featured speaker or not? You need to know. Always keep it simple. Have a simple take-home message which you'll repeat at the end for your audience to remember and take home with them. Always tell a story, or 2 or 3. In particular, if your presentation is a technical one. Why? Well, technical presentations can sometimes be just a little bit too much to digest. And if you can break it up with a story, I'm talking about a relevant story that has to do with what you're talking about, then it will break it up for the audience. And people love stories. You can tell a story about yourself or someone you knew, providing that it links in with the topic that you're giving. Always share personally. If you share from the heart and share from your passion and from your belief and conviction, then the audience will be connected to you. You will be able to relate to your audience and they to you, most particularly if you also use eye contact. If you're using PowerPoint, fine, but use it sparingly. You know about death by PowerPoint. I'm sure you've experienced that yourself. Whatever you put on your PowerPoint slides, don't clutter it too much. Much better to use pictures or symbols than lots of text. If you know your audience, then you can plan how to connect with the people in it. And if you connect with them, you will be able, more likely, to influence their thinking. If you have thoroughly researched your audience, the venue, the equipment there, and adapted your speech accordingly, you will be able to channel any nervous feelings that you have into enthusiasm and energy for your speech. And then you will be able to relax and enjoy yourself. I'm now going to ask you to look at the group activity workshop contained in this module. I would like you to outline 3 main points that you would make for different audiences about the topic, your future, what are your options? The material that you present may relate to the material from your written communication modules if you wish. And I would also like you to describe any visual aids that you would use if it's relevant. So notice this is not a presentation I'm asking you to give. What I'm asking from you is the 3 main points you would make to the different audiences and describe the kind of visual aids you would use if you do. The different audiences are given in Module 4 in that section, and they are high school students, young professionals, a bushland regeneration group, young parents, and retirees. All different types of audiences. With your group now, prepare and present a 3-minute presentation where you give this information. And we'll have a look and discuss this together.